I think that people imagine that John was always the kind of peace and love guy, but there was a moment where he fell in with Jerry Rubin, and Rubin was a kind of much more radical, revolutionary type. And John was very fascinated by his belief that maybe violence was the only way to overthrow the regime. But then John starts to wake up and feel that he's being used, and he begins to think, actually, I don't want Beatles fans to be taken to the Republican convention and then get beaten up by the police. I think at that moment, he then sort of recommitted himself to the notion of peace.
I'm Justin Jay, and this is The Plug. There's an old parable about three blind men describing an elephant. One feels the trunk and thinks it's a snake. Another grabs a leg and insists that it's a tree. And a third touches the side and believes that it's a wall. Each understands a piece of the truth, but none can see the full picture. Our guest today is the director of 1 to 1, a new film that challenges what we think we know about John Lennon's post-Beatles life in the early 1970s. The film pieces together fragments of his life while living in New York's West Village to give us a fuller, more three-dimensional understanding of the pressures, influences, and motivations that shaped him. Instead of leaning on contemporary interviews or traditional biographical narration, the film relies almost entirely on archival material: news reports, protest footage, sitcoms, street scenes, vintage commercials, and intimate, never-before-seen footage of John and Yoko. It's an immersive and sometimes chaotic glimpse into the world they were living in. The result is a portrait of Lennon shaped by context rather than commentary, and the film gives us unique insight into his personal life in 1971. So why did Bob Dylan's Trash briefly play a role in the anti-war movement? And what became of John and Yoko's Bank Street apartment? We'll find out as we sit down with the filmmaker trusted by the Lennon estate to bring this extraordinary footage to life. Today, director and Academy Award winner, Mr. Kevin Macdonald. All right, and we're rolling. Kevin Macdonald, thanks for sitting down. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for doing this.
Right? It's lovely to be here in the Rockefeller Center. I never thought I'd ever do something professional in the Rockefeller Center.
Yeah, well, also, let's give a quick shout out to Newsstand Studios here in Rockefeller Plaza for hosting us today. And it is fitting that we're recording in such an iconic building because the movie that just is about to come out, 1 to 1, that you directed, it's about John Lennon and Yoko Ono in New York City in the early 1970s. But in a way, it almost feels like a love letter to New York City as well, from a very particular time period. And can you tell us a little about that? Just set the stage a little bit.
Yeah, so when I was approached about making this documentary by the producer, Peter Worsley, he had got the rights to the concert, the 1 to 1 concert, which is the only concert that John gave after leaving the Beatles, actually. It was here in New York, Madison Square Gardens in, I think, August 72. And he said, is there a documentary you could make around the concert? And I said, there's been enough Beatles films. There's been enough John Lennon films. The world doesn't need any more of those. But then I kind of thought, I wonder whether there's a way, I could make a film that's not really about him. Yeah, he's at the heart of it, Yoko and him, but that's actually about New York and about the time period, about 1972 when it's set. So the whole movie is actually made up of clips, archive clips of them, but also from the TV that they're watching. And we rebuilt their apartment to have a sort of set where you see the TV that they're watching. And it's all from that time period. It was very strict in the rules that everything we have in this film is from that time period. There's no external voices. It's just their voices. Yeah,
that was one of the things that struck me first about this movie is the style of the direction. The film unfolds, it's almost with no context. There's no present day interviews, there's no voiceovers, there's not really a lot of explanation of some of the characters other than John and Yoko. And instead, you kind of weave together this incredible amount of archival footage with the film and audio of John to kind of create this narrative. And what was interesting is it feels like the film itself could have been made in the period when the film was set. I mean, this kind of verite approach, it felt really reminiscent of like D.A. Pennebaker or the Maisel brothers. I mean, was that an approach that was intentional from the very beginning, or did it kind of evolve once you took this project on?
That was there from the beginning. I've made a lot of documentaries over the years, and a lot of documentaries set in the past, and I'm always fascinated by the sort of question of, how do you best represent the past, to represent what people were thinking, what they were like in a previous era. Now, obviously, most historical documentaries, it's like historians or talking heads or the bandmates from the band or whatever it is. But that's all been done with the Beatles. That's been done to death. So this felt like an opportunity to do something that's on the edge of being an experimental movie, I suppose, where you're totally immersive. So you are like John and Yoko watching TV in 1972 with them in their apartment, and they're flicking through the channels. And so you get a news show, you get a commercial, you get a bit of the Mary Tyler Moore show, you get all these different things. And you get this sort of immersive sense of what it's like to be living in that period. And then slowly you also start to get a sense of their characters, and you have phone conversations with John and Yoko, which maybe we'll talk about later in more detail. But so yeah, I wanted it to be this kind of this immersive idea. And I took a lot of inspiration from a famous New York filmmaker, although I think he was originally from Lithuania, called Jonas Mekas, who's, I think the anthology film archives are still there, actually, which was his kind of HQ and a little theater there, and they showed experimental films. And he also developed this style of filmmaking using an old Bolex 16mm camera, which he'd shoot sometimes just like single frames, and capture a sense of a place and a time with this camera. And he used these cards, which he type wrote out on a bit of paper and then just filmed for a few frames to kind of explain what was going on. And I kind of stole that idea.
Which is really the only explanation. I mean, it takes a minute to get into this film because it's a little bit unnerving in the sense that there's no explanation, there's no introduction,
You're just there.
There's no interviews, there's no context, and it's like you said, it's very immersive.
Well, I kind of felt like that. Well, I think maybe this is just me, but I feel like that's how life is. That life is, we are all experiencing such an onslaught of sensation and images and sounds and all the time, and we have to deliberately choose. What is my narrative for the day? What am I going to pay attention to, and what am I not? And this film kind of reproduces that kind of effect. It's kind of like all these sights and sound and images of New York at that time, but then you slowly begin to focus down and cut out the noise and see the narrative within it. So that was kind of like my pretentious approach.
There's a great line from John Lennon where he says, "If you want to know what Americans are talking about Saturday night, it's what they saw on the TV Friday night." And I learned in this movie what a fan of television John Lennon was. He loved to watch television. And it makes sense because there's some amazing archival footage in this. I mean, you have clips from, I wrote this down, The Price is Right, scenes from the Attica prison uprising, anti-war protests, the bank robbery that Dog Day Afternoon was eventually based on, the Black Liberation Army plane hijacking, Umberto's Clam House, Gangland Style. I mean, there's so much, it's so dense. And I imagine that you were obviously heavily involved in the editing process of this film. Like, talk to me about how you are able to juxtapose these seemingly unrelated pieces of footage together to make
they're related.
A narrative, a story.
Yeah, they're related by the fact they're all happening at the same time. And, if you were to make a conventional documentary with all of those things in it, you'd have to explain them all and make the connections between how they... But the great thing is this is a 90-minute film. It's not too long. And you get all human life is there, and you have to make those connections yourself. And as you say, I think for some people it takes a moment to get into it. I think maybe people stick around because John's very funny. There's a lot of humor in it. He's hilarious. I suppose that unlike most films, the approach the editor and I took was we want people to feel like for a moment this is chaos, this is just anarchy, and then to start having a sense of there is a narrative here. The filmmakers are trying to say something here, and that as you go through it, you're constantly on that edge of anarchy and narrative sense. And
was there a lot of footage that you found that you knew that you wanted to use and then needed to find a place to put them? Or did it work the other way? Like you started with John's footage and tried to find stuff that was representative that would work?
Well, we started the structure with the concert itself, so that we decided there's like 10 songs that we wanted to use from the concert. So it's like, okay, what sort of order should we have those in? We roughly laid them out in order. And then it's like, okay, so what are the things, you look through the TV schedules of the time, and you say, what could they have been watching? Oh, well, you know, obviously you need to have a little bit of the Waltons because that's like the iconic thing, and that was its first year of running and whatever. And so I'm going to have a little bit of the Waltons, and what might that relate to? I'm going to have the Vietnam War present here because the Vietnam War is raging still. The students are on the streets, you know, it's a bit like today with Gaza. Well, we got to make something of that. So how can we represent the Vietnam War in an interesting way that is different than what you might have seen before, and the kind of use different clips that might have been on TV at that time. So it was kind of like improvisational in a way. And so just we'd cut a sequence and we'd go into a song, and then we'd go, feels like it needs some humor, or it feels like it needs, that bit doesn't work. So it's like very much an emotional response, actually. It's not like a normal documentary response, or even a dramatic feature, which I also do. Is not the same kind of approach to editing. It's very much a kind of like it's more like cooking.
Yeah,
it's more like, is there enough salt? Is there too much salt?
I'm curious how directing this film compares with some of your past projects, because you directed Life in a Day, which had, I think, 80,000 clips that were submitted from people all over the world. And it seems like the challenge with a project like that was how to shape this enormous amount of material into something cohesive. Whereas with this film, it seems like almost the opposite problem. You have a relatively limited amount of footage of John and Yoko, and the challenge is to kind of find a way to build around that and to make a story that makes sense. I mean, how do you go about putting all of those puzzle pieces into something coherent?
Well, that's the fun about documentary, is that everyone is different. I always think there's as many different kinds of documentary as there are different kinds of nonfiction writing. You know, you can write letters, and you can write a biography, you can write an encyclopedia, and they're all nonfiction writing. And it's like there's many different approaches to documentary, and that's one of the things that's exciting about it. It's much more open, creative possibilities around documentary actually than there is about fiction, I think. But in a way, the two films, Life in a Day, which we made one of in 2010, one in 2020, which were using clips that people uploaded from all over the world. You know, I think we represented 190 countries or something in the first one. That was kind of like the idea is, how do you capture the world in a single day? And it has this kind of, you know, like flowing musical structure. It takes place over, you know, roughly chronologically, but it's a kind of like there's no real story as such. It's just the story of the day. And I think in a way, this film, One to One, is similar in a way. And I certainly took some inspiration from it in that it's trying to capture the sense of New York and of 1972 in a film, while also the added complication of trying to tell a story of John and Yoko and how they came to make this concert. Because that's really what I guess the narrative of the film is. How come John and Yoko did only one concert after the Beatles, and how come it was this one, and why, you know, what happened to make that concert possible?
This film takes place while John and Yoko were living on Bank Street in the West Village in New York. And you meticulously recreated that apartment, including the interior, and you set dressed it. And in many ways, that apartment itself feels like a character in this movie. And I'm just wondering, like, why did you feel that it was such an important device to include in this movie? And how did you even go about researching and creating that set?
Well, I think first of all, I thought that we needed something like that. We needed a moment of peacefulness within this film, which is a kind of cacophony of different clips and sounds and jumping around. And you want moments of just like stillness, you know, or you're gently moving, often not still, through this apartment. But it's a moment of quietness and peace, I think. But it's also a reminder of them in the film. So it's like the idea is, you know, you're in this apartment, the TV's always on quietly maybe, and you're imagining, they've gone out to get a cup of coffee and they've left their cigarette burning, and otherwise it's like exactly their apartment. And so in order to achieve that feeling, we thought, okay, can't just be a kind of cheap kind of reconstruction. This needs to be kind of an obsessive, totally anal reconstruction of where they lived. And so we went to incredible detail to find, you know, the same guitar that John had, we've got someone in New York who rented it to us for an enormous amount of money. We found the amplifier that he had. We found we had to get his bedspread made. We couldn't find that bedspread anywhere. We had it made, specially woven by someone.
And there was a lot of archival photos to
There
work
was some
off of.
archival photos. There's like about 30 or 40 photographs of them during that year and a half in the apartment. We pieced them together with magnifying glass, looking to see what they had. And then there was lists of all the books they had at that time and all the records they had with them that actually Yoko had done when they moved into the Dakota building, which they did in 1973. They'd done a list of all the things they took with them. So we knew what books. So we were able to sort of say, okay, that book that we can see on that shelf, that might be this thing that is on the list. Let's find that. And then we would go off and find the exact edition from that period and we'd put it in there. So we took it to a crazy length. We even had like the letters that we knew he'd been writing at that moment, which the family found some of them for us. And we, made copies of them and put them in the set, even though you can't read them, but those are the letters he was writing at that time.
So authentic.
So it's totally authentic. And I think there's something about that which takes it beyond, I'm sure they're doing this movie now about the Beatles, aren't they? They're doing the four movies, the Beatles years from the four different perspectives of the different members of the band. And I'm sure they won't be going to that degree of authenticity on that, because you wouldn't normally on a movie. But there's something about kind of fetishizing the reality of the space, even though it was built in a studio in London, not anywhere near Manhattan. But there's something about the fetishization of that and the attention to detail that I think comes across and makes you feel sort of differently about it.
The authenticity of that really, it just made it feel so intimate and really helped it come alive.
I want people to feel like they're sitting on a bed with John and Yoko next to them, chilling out, having a smoke and watching the TV with them as they chat away.
This film, it deals with a lot of the fissures in the anti-war movement that are happening at the time. And in the first half of the movie, Jerry Rubin and John Sinclair play a really big part of the movie. And then eventually John starts to kind of distance himself from those two people and essentially even accuses Jerry Rubin of trying to incite a riot at the Republican convention with no clear strategy of what he's really going to try and accomplish. And that's a really complicated narrative to try and convey without a script or, any sort of voiceover. And you did a really amazing job of that. I love what you did. You used vintage rodeo footage with people kind of struggling to control these thrashing animals in a not so subtle visual metaphor for the volatility of the anti-war movement at the time. What did you want the takeaway to be from that chapter of the film?
Well, I think you did a very good job of describing what we were trying to do. I think that people imagined that John was always the kind of peace and love guy, but there was a moment there in 72 where he fell in with Jerry Rubin, and Rubin was a kind of much more radical, revolutionary type, and John thought he was very glamorous and was fascinated by him and fascinated by his belief that, maybe violence was the only way to overthrow the regime and that, Nixon was a fascist and, but then John starts to wake up to that a little bit and feel that he's being used by Rubin. And he starts to distance himself from him and he begins to think, actually, I don't want Beatles fans to be taken to the Republican convention because they're there to see me. Because the original idea was that Jerry wanted him to play a concert at the Republican convention for the protesters. And John was thinking, well, I don't want my fame and the fact that I've got all these Beatles fans to bring young kids down there and then them get beaten up by the police and God knows what's going to happen to them. And he was right. It did turn into a very violent event and a lot of people ended up with their heads split open. And, I think at that moment, he then sort of recommitted himself to the notion of peace. And I think that, to me, is a valuable lesson to learn because I think we can all, whether on left or right, feel that violence is the only solution at some points because such is our frustration. But of course, that's only going to lead to nihilism and destruction. And so I think, what John experienced and what he went through then is something that we can all learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the major themes of this film is John's transformation during that period. And, he moved from this kind of broad political activism to more of a practical, introspective approach. And there's a great line in the movie. He says, it's easier to shout revolution than to stare in the mirror and know yourself. And you see that a lot in the people that he surrounds himself in, but also in the type of activism that he decides to involve himself in. It kind of goes from, give peace a chance and war is over and these kind of broad themes to, really practical, specific actions that have an immediate effect. And so, much of the footage of this film comes from this benefit concert that he did at Madison Square Garden. And can you talk a little bit about how that concert came together and then also how that came to be the framework for this film?
Yeah. Well, I'll just rewind a little bit to the John Sinclair concert that he played at, which was John Sinclair was this guy who was arrested in Michigan for having, I think it was 2 joints in his pocket, and he got 5 years in prison. And it became this big countercultural kind of focus of protest, and there was a concert, a benefit concert that was organized, and John and Yoko flew in and did a couple of songs, including a song called John Sinclair. And lo and behold, 2 days later, Sinclair is released from prison. And that's the spark that sets John off on this political journey, because he's like, oh, I can actually have an effect on the way that people are imprisoned or not imprisoned, or, I can get people out of jail. And I should use my celebrity to do that more. So he starts planning this with Jerry Rubin, and Jerry's actually going to be in the band. He starts planning a tour, which is going to be called the Free the People tour, and they decide that they need to get Bob Dylan to join them, because if they have Bob Dylan and John Lennon, unstoppable, and they're going to have the youth there turning out in force, and they're going to be able to change people's political minds politically. And they're also going to use all the takings from the box office to give bail to people who are in prison in every town they go. And they've got these very idealistic kind of ideas. But first of all, Bob Dylan refuses to be a part of it for various arcane reasons, which you go into in a way in the film. But at the same time, John falls out with Jerry Rubin, but he's still thinking, well, I was going to do a concert. I wanted to do a benefit concert. And he'd already started rehearsing with this band, the Elephants Memory Band. And then they see on TV a Geraldo Rivera report about Willowbrook, which is a school or a kind of institution, not really a school, for mentally and physically disabled kids in upstate New York. And it's so shocking, this report. These kids, 5,000 kids, they're living in medieval conditions. They're being left to kind of, shit on the floor and to throw their food around. I mean, it's the most upsetting material you'll ever see, actually. And John Yoko watched that. And they were so heartbroken, and they decided, this is what we're going to do the benefit concert for them, for these kids. And I think that's the political change, isn't it? It's from being kind of abstract revolution, stand against Nixon, to actually thinking, no, that doesn't work. The politics that I want to be involved in is directly helping individuals. What can I actually do? I can make these particular kids, I can make their lives better. And I think that's a very interesting message for today, actually. It's all very well for people to kind of write op-eds and get angry and tweet and, get everyone riled up. Actually, if you want to make the world a better place, go and do a good thing for somebody else. Make the world a better place, in actuality, rather than just talking about it.
Yeah. It was fascinating in the movie to hear in real time them talking with Alan Klein about Bob Dylan and his involvement. And we learned that, the reason that we have these audio clips in the film is because John Lennon was convinced that the feds were wiretapping his phone. Spoiler alert, they were. And as a result, he decides to start recording all of his own phone conversations. And some of them are incredibly eerie to listen to. And there's one conversation with I believe it's his drummer, Jim Keltner. Yeah. And he asks John, he says, do you ever get worried about somebody and he kind of doesn't finish his sentence. And John makes him finish his sentence, even though he knows exactly what he's talking about. And there's something so chilling about hearing John Lennon kind of defiantly address the possibility of somebody murdering him for his political beliefs. And I was wondering, was that a parallel that you intentionally wanted to draw in this film?
I think it wasn't where I started off thinking the film was going to go, but it had an energy of its own. The film became more and more about today and the reflection of then and now. And I think now, actually, when I watch the film, I think, actually, this is a film about now.
It feels very contemporary.
It's very contemporary. I mean, the parallels are incredible, and a lot of those parallels actually emerged even after we finished the film. So you have Shirley Chisholm plays a major role in the film, and then the first black woman to stand for president, run for president, and lo and behold, the film is finished, and we have Kamala Harris, actually getting close to being the president. You had George Wallace, right-wing kind of demagogue who makes these terrible, racist speeches, very reminiscent of a certain other person.
I mean, there was a scene with George Wallace that it felt so contemporary. There's a scene where after his assassination, it cuts to like a man on the street interview, and this black man basically says, "How do you feel about it?" And he's like, "I couldn't care less if he died," and then they cut to George Wallace, and he's talking about how unsafe it is to walk in Baltimore and in New York and in Washington, D.C., and talking about the inner city, and the same rhetoric that you hear from the Trump administration talk about modern city.
100%. And I think that emerged without us really wanting it to. I didn't set out to make a film about that was about the parallels between then and now, but the film undoubtedly is. And I think actually that's a lot of people who have watched the film who are not, say, huge Lennon fans or whatever, that's what they take away from it most, actually, is, God, history is cyclical. And there's something depressing about that. We don't learn from our mistakes. We do the same thing over again. But there's also maybe some hope there that this too shall pass.
Yeah. I mean, and also just the kind of tragic irony that John Lennon was ultimately murdered for nothing to do with his politics,
100%. And I actually, when the film was finished, I showed it to Sean Lennon and sat next to him. We showed it at a little theater. And when that piece came up, suddenly I'm sitting right next to him, and I had this whole other power to it. And I felt, oh my God, must be so difficult to hear your father saying this. But then actually, as I then considered it, I thought, no, this must be, he feels quite heroic. Here's John saying, I'm not worrying about that. I'm not worrying about somebody shooting me. I'm just a musician, who does politics. I'm not a politician. They're not going to go after me, and I'm going to carry on doing what I'm doing. So and actually, it was those phone calls were the great sort of find of the film, because originally they weren't in the film, and we were 2/3 of the way through the edit, and it was a much denser kind of film, less personal about them. And then I get a phone call from the Lennon estate saying, "Oh, we just found this box. We don't know what's in it. It says audio recordings, Bank Street, 1972." And they just found this. God. They said, do you want to see it? Do you want to hear it? And I said, of course I want to hear it. And so they sent over like 30 hours of this stuff. And it's the closest you'll ever get to sort of feeling like what it was like to be with them, to sit with them, and just sort of chill and hang out, because they're not necessarily always about something significant, although there are a few calls like that that are very significant. But it's just like you get a sense of them when they're off. It's not interviews that they're doing where they're kind of pretending to be something. They're actually just, they're talking to their friends. They're talking to journalists.
And some of the banalities of conversations with Alan Klein.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you about that. So there's a lot of clips in this movie where Lennon's assistant is trying to source live flies. And like so much in this movie, there's really no context for it. It almost feels almost like an inside joke that the viewer is not in on. And at the end, it's kind of revealed that it's for some sort of an art project. But can you just explain, like, why did you decide to put that in the movie? And what was that all about?
Well, I think that when I listened to these audio tapes, about 30% of them were Yoko or her assistants desperately trying to find flies in the middle of winter in New York for an art piece that she wanted to do, which turns out to be, it was like photographing flies crawling around naked people's bodies. And so there was just that increasingly frantic phone calls, particularly from her assistants, who are obviously being told, where are the flies, trying to figure out where to get them. And as I listened to it, I thought, this is very funny. And it also could be a kind of running gag through the film. And so we use it like 4 times, I think. And I thought that, first of all, it tells you as a viewer, oh, they're coming back to the same thing. there's some tension there. I want to know, what is this thing with the flies?
And there was even different assistants are tasked with trying to
exactly.
To get the flies.
And so I thought that you need to have in a film like this that you're always fighting. You don't want people to think it's not going anywhere. So it's just markers that you put down saying, oh, this story is going somewhere. There's a story about the flies. Where's this going? But also it's about Yoko as an artist. It's about the kind of, I wanted to represent the fact that she's this conceptual artist who does these crazy things involving, flies crawling around, whatever. So it gives you a flavor of that other side of their lives, which is the art side, which we didn't go into too much. It's the conceptual side. And you do end with seeing the flies crawling over the naked woman being filmed, and Yoko's then going to put that in an exhibition, I guess.
Yeah. I felt like this film paints Yoko Ono in a very humanizing light. It's very sympathetic towards her. And, she discusses in this movie how she used to get her hair pulled on the street in London during the Beatles years. And she reveals that she actually developed a stutter at one point as a result of all of the, bitterness and hatred. And
she had a couple of miscarriages. She also says that, doesn't she?
The whole storyline of her ex-husband and her estranged daughter. I had no idea about it.
It's a crazy story that her ex-husband actually kidnapped their daughter, and took her to America, and then sort of disappeared, and they joined a kind of Christian cult kind of thing. And Yoko and John actually came to America because they were looking for that daughter. That's how they ended up here, because there was they were paying for all these private investigators to travel around and try and find them. But in those days, somebody wanted to go off grid and not be found. It was pretty easy, I think. So there's all the way through the film, you're thinking, oh, poor Yoko. She's a mum who's lost her kid. And this is going on for months, years at a time. And in fact, the truth is revealed at the end of the film is that Yoko never saw that daughter again until the 90s. Wow. Kyoko. And so, that's a part of that plays into this bigger theme in the film about children, childhood, damaged children, that kind of thing. So you've got obviously the Willowbrook residents, these kids, these disabled kids. You've got John talking about his own terrible childhood, his mum being killed in front of him, his dad, he didn't know his dad growing up. And then you've got Yoko with her missing daughter. So there is this sort of feeling that actually it's very appropriate that, the one concert that they did was in benefit of for kids. And that's why I also chose to end the film with some Super 8 footage that Sean Lennon gave me of him when he was just after he was born with John and Yoko, and they're so happy as new parents. And it's a very beautiful, optimistic ending to the film. Originally, actually, the ending was different. It was Bank Street, the apartment. I went to visit it when I was making the film, and they were tearing it down, and they were just keeping the facade. And the developer just developed that building and the one next door into a $75 million home, and with a swimming pool and all that stuff. And
just kept the doorway?
Kept the doorways and kept the spiral staircase, the metal spiral staircase that you see in the film. They've kept that because that's a link to John Lennon. But I asked the developer, can we go in the backyard and look? And where on the day that I was visiting, on exactly where the room was, that their bedroom was, where they lived, and which you see in the film, there was a digger digging it out. It was like the foundations of that building was dug out. And so I went and got a camera quickly. We filmed this digger digging it out, and that was the ending. And it was really beautiful, but a real downer too. It had this kind of
a very different tone.
Kind of a dust to feel. And actually, that was when I showed the film to Sean. He said, "Well, I really liked the film, but that's such a downer of an ending." And I was like, "Yeah, you might be right, actually." So, and then he was the one actually who suggested, "Look, I've got all this home movie footage that nobody's ever seen of me as a kid, as a baby in Babe in Arms. Do you want to use that instead?" And I realized then that I was like, "Oh, of course, that's the perfect ending, because this is all about children, and this is here's the kind of like the happy ending. These two people who have in various ways damaged themselves as children get to have a child and to love that child."
Wow. Oh, well, yeah, it was really interesting just getting to see another side of Yoko Ono. It's very humanizing. And, I've always had a lot of respect for Yoko Ono as, a visual artist and as a strong woman. That said, I have always found her music to be, let's say, challenging to listen to, which I think is...
Well, I think people misunderstand the music, because I think there's in in the film, you see both sides of her as a musician. You see her singing harmonies with John on The Luck of the Irish, when they're just sitting, jamming in their apartment. And she does it beautifully. She's got a beautiful voice. But then you see her at the concert and she's singing Don't Worry, Kyoko, which is about her missing daughter and the pain of that. And she sings it like sort of Patti Smith at her wildest.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of like a performance piece. It's sort of like she's screaming, she's thrashing about on the floor. And I think what people don't understand is that it's a kind of like, that's what it's meant to be. It's not like she's not trying to sing beautifully and can't do it, because you've heard her already. She can sing beautifully, but it's about the fact that she's using music in a different way, more like an artist, a conceptual artist would, to express her whole emotion.
See, that's such an interesting description, because I've always wondered, somebody who is married to one of the most gifted and acclaimed songwriters of all time, like, why would she choose to pursue making music to almost universal criticism? I mean, especially when she's such a already well-pedigreed and respected visual artist. I mean, did you get any
I don't know the
into
answer to that, but I would just say that I think she saw the music as a kind of offshoot to her art. And you got to remember that Imagine, for instance, was actually co-written by Yoko. She wrote the lyrics, really. Those lyrics are basically versions of things that she wrote in a book called Grapefruit that came out in the 60s before she even knew John. And John himself has said, I think many times, I should have given Yoko co-writing credit on that. Really, it was her. It was her lyrics. But I think at the end of the film, when John and Yoko go up to Harvard to this first ever international feminist conference, you then hear Yoko singing a song called Age 39. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. And it's the most confessional piece in the whole film. It's basically her talking about being a 39-year-old woman who's probably, whose daughter is missing, who knows she's totally neurotic. And maybe it's a good thing she's thinking that my daughter's not with me, because maybe I wouldn't be a good mother. And she's contemplating suicide. She's talking about being in a hotel room, looking out the window and thinking, maybe I should just kill myself. And she also talks about how when she met John, she developed a stutter and she lost all her confidence, because how can you be with this great icon and retain your identity? So I kind of feel like, actually, in a certain way, she is a very interesting musician. And that's totally confessional kind of song, but it has an emotional impact. She's not the world's best singer. She's not the world's best writer of melody necessarily, but she does something that is her own thing, and which I think has real value.
She's misunderstood. Like the backstory,
I think she's misunderstood.
How and why she's making that movie was never really grasped by a lot of people.
I think so, but I don't know. I never met Yoko. She's still alive, Yoko. She's not involved in the estate anymore. Sean Lennon, her son, Ono Lennon.
So you didn't meet her at all during this?
I didn't meet her at all. He has now taken over. This, I think, was the first thing that he was this was like, okay, I'm taking over the estate. I'm making the decisions.
Wow.
And and it was really nice, actually, when we finished that, when we showed Sean the film, and the first thing he said to me was, this is the only film I've seen which captures who my mother was. And
that's really special.
Yeah, it was really nice. And he told this funny story, because there's a moment in the film where Allen Ginsberg, the poet, recites a poem at Yoko's opening of her exhibition, and it's about how different people wipe their behinds
with paper, toilet paper,
and toilet paper, or not with toilet, or whatever. And Yoko's got this sort of, what to me seemed like quite a kind of like unreadable expression on her face as he's doing this. She certainly doesn't seem to be loving it. And Sean said, that was my favorite moment. And I said, why? And he said, because I knew that expression on my mum's face. That was the neat freak, hygiene freak that my mum was, having to sit and listen to a poem about defecation and hand wiping your bum. She was so uncomfortable. She was hating it.
That's so cool. Well, I mean, I want to get back just at the top of the show. You said, there's been so many movies made about the Beatles. And, if somebody was to say, listen, I've seen Get Back, I've seen Imagine, I've seen US versus John Lennon. What could I possibly learn from watching One to One? I mean, what would you say? What makes this movie special?
Everything and nothing. I mean, it's like, you're not going to, if you're a kind of person who wants a lot of new facts about the Beatles, you're not necessarily going to get them from this. If you want a few good jokes from John Lennon, you'll get those. But if you want to see John in concert at the height of his powers, singing brilliantly, and to know what it would have been like to actually see him live, then you get that from this. But you're also going to get a sense of what it was like to hang out with them, to be intimate with them, to be in their presence as people. And I think you come out of it with more respect for them, maybe even than if you're a big fan than you had before, but understanding them on some human level like you didn't before, but understanding within the context of their times. So, it's interesting talking about this film because it's a 90-minute film, but it has so many different
It's very
parts
dense.
of it. It's very dense. And there's so much going on. And so, it feels to a listener who's listening to this podcast, they must think, this film's got so many things jammed in, but then it doesn't feel jammed in, I don't think. It doesn't feel that. Actually, I would say to you, it feels entertaining. I hope it's entertaining.
Yeah.
It was certainly intended to be entertaining. The best review I had from the film was somebody went to see it, and as a filmmaker, you get these, after these screenings that they do, they asked the journalist for like a one-line response. What did you think? What did you think? And this guy said, he said to me, I usually hate experimental films, but I really enjoyed this one. And I thought, that's great.
Kind of a backhanded compliment, but okay. Well, we always like to end the podcast by asking our guests to plug something that they're not directly involved in, but they feel isn't getting enough attention, whether that's could be a book, a movie, a TV show, a social cause, an artist. Is there something that you're really loving lately that you want to give a little more attention to?
Wow, I wish I'd thought about that before. I wish I'd known about that before. Well, the artistic experience that has struck me the most in the last few months is I watched at a film festival a Russian film from the late 50s called The Cranes Are Flying. And I think this is a somewhat well-known film in connoisseurs of Russian cinema, but I'd never seen it before, and I saw it on the big screen. And this film went instantly into my top 10 of all time. It's so visually inventive, brilliantly shot, moving, incredibly acted. It's about a woman whose new boyfriend goes off to war and doesn't come back. And her sense of denial, she keeps searching for him. She thinks she must still be alive. And you're not quite sure until the very ending. And it's about the pain of war. And it's so not what you think of as the Soviet Union in the 50s. It's human. And it puts the war into a very human context. It's not propagandistic at all. And it's just like the best shot thing you can ever imagine. So I would say to people,
tell me the title again,
it's called The Cranes Are Flying. I won't try and say it for you in Russian.
Cool. Well, that's a very heady plug, but I will definitely check that out. That sounds really interesting. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time. This was really interesting, getting to kind of get some of the backstory. 1-to-1 is going to be premiering on HBO. It's absolutely worth watching. It's a very dense, interesting documentary. Really pay attention and kind of just, you have to be a little zen because there's a lot of characters. Not all of them are explained, but that's not really what it's about.
Switch off the rational part of your mind.
Yes.
And just sit back and let it flow over you. I've found that actually the people who like this most are kind of 18-year-olds who are used to experiencing this on TikTok. This is how they experience the world.
So interesting because this is, if anything, this is the polar opposite of, I think in the 90s, like with late 90s, early 2000s, with the kind of VH1 behind the music, it became so formulaic the way music documentaries were put together. And it worked, and they were still enjoyable, and there was 3 acts and an arc, but it's definitely not that. And so if you're in the mood just to kind of experience something and you're a fan of the John Lennon or the Beatles, it's a wonderful watch. So bravo.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you.
Cheers. Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to today's guest for dropping in. If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor and take a minute to rate, review, follow, or subscribe. This episode of The Plug contains original theme music by Andrew Van Weingarten and Dan Drohan. Mixing and sound design by Matt Boynton at Ultraviolet Audio. Logo and branding by Italic at italic-studio.com. And you can check out my photography at justinj.com. Thanks again, and be sure to check out the archive and tune in for future conversations.